The Bible states that the flood destroyed all flesh on earth, but centuries later giants appear again. How is it possible that the Nephilim returned if they were supposedly annihilated by the waters of divine judgment? This contradiction has disturbed theologians for millennia, and the answer could change everything we think we know. Before the flood, the sons of God descended to earth and took wives for themselves from the daughters of men. From this forbidden union the Nephilim were born, beings of enormous stature who dominated the antediluvian world. Genesis chapter 6 describes how these giants filled the earth with violence and extreme corruption. God observed that human wickedness was great and that every intent of their heart was only evil continually. Then he decided to send the flood to wipe from the face of the earth both men and Nephilim. Noah was the only righteous man found in his generation, perfect in his genealogies, according to the original Hebrew text. God commanded him to build an ark to preserve his family and representatives of every animal species. The waters covered even the highest mountains, and every living being that breathed air perished under the waters. The destruction was total and absolute. No terrestrial creature survived outside the ark according to the biblical account. However, something inexplicable occurs barely 400 years after the flood in the narrative of the scriptures. When the Israelite spies explore the land of Canaan, they return terrified, speaking of giants. In Numbers 13, the explorers declare they have seen the sons of Enoch, descendants of the Nephilim. They claim to feel like grasshoppers compared to the enormous stature of these beings that inhabited that land. If all the Nephilim died in the flood, where did these new giants mentioned in Canaan come from? This question has divided biblical scholars into two camps with radically different theories about the origin. The first theory holds that there was a second incursion of fallen angels after the universal flood. According to this interpretation, the sons of God mixed again with human women, creating a new generation. The apocryphal Book of Enoch suggests that 200 watcher angels descended to Mount Hermon with forbidden intentions. These rebellious celestial beings would have taught humans hidden knowledge of magic, war, and astrology. The subsequent union with women would have generated new Nephilim, explaining the presence of post-diluvian giants. This theory finds support in biblical references about angels who did not keep their original dignity. Judas. Chapter 6 mentions angels who abandon their own dwelling and are kept in eternal chains. However, this interpretation poses complex theological questions about angelic free will after the judgment. Why would fallen angels commit the same error again that had already resulted in catastrophic punishment? Some ancient texts suggest that different factions of rebellious angels operated with distinct strategies. While some were chained immediately, others would have remained free to continue their agenda of corruption. The second theory proposes something even more disturbing. Some Nephilim or their offspring survived the flood itself. Genesis 6:13 says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also after this. The Hebrew expression "and also after" has intrigued translators for centuries due to its deliberate temporal ambiguity. Could it mean that some Nephilim continued to exist even after the catastrophic event of the flood? A controversial possibility suggests that one of Noah's sons or their wives carried contaminated genetics. The Bible emphasizes that Noah was perfect in his generations, but it does not make the same statement about others. If any of the wives of Noah's sons had Nephilim ancestry, the giant genes would have crossed over. This theory would explain why Canaan, son of Ham, was cursed specifically after the incident in the tent. Some ancient rabbinic texts suggest that the curse was related to a pre-existing genetic corruption in that line. The Canaanites, descendants of Ham, were precisely those who inhabited the land where the later giants appeared. Og, king of Bashan, is described as the last of the Rephaim with an iron bed of 4 meters. Goliath of Gath measured 6 cubits and a span, approximately 3 meters tall according to ancient measurements. These were not isolated cases, but entire families of giants that dominated specific regions of Canaan. Deuteronomy mentions the Amim, the Zamzummim, and the Anakim as peoples of gigantic stature and military power. The divine order to completely exterminate the Canaanites takes on a different meaning under this genetic perspective. It was not simply territorial conquest, but elimination of a corruption that threatened divine creation again. Joshua and the Israelites were to completely destroy these contaminated lines to preserve the purity of humanity. David and his mighty men killed several Philistine giants, suggesting that the problem persisted for generations. The texts mention specifically Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Goliath, and a man of great stature with 6 fingers on each extremity. This polydactyly, extra fingers, appears repeatedly in descriptions of giants suggesting specific genetic markers. Some Jewish traditions claim that Og of Bashan managed to survive the flood by clinging to the outside of the ark. According to these accounts, Noah passed him food through an opening, but never allowed him to enter completely. This extra-canonic narrative attempts to explain how such an ancient giant could exist centuries after the flood. There also exists a third, less-known theory that involves advanced technologically prediluvian genetic manipulation. The Book of Enoch describes how the fallen angels taught seed manipulation and unnatural crosses. If the antediluvians mastered primitive biotechnology, they could have preserved genetic material in some unknown form. This interpretation connects with global myths about advanced civilizations destroyed by cataclysms, but which left knowledge behind. Sumerians, Egyptians, and Mesoamerican cultures speak of tall beings who brought wisdom after great global floods. Pyramids, megaliths, and cyclopean structures suggest constructive capabilities that exceed normal human strength. Could these monuments be physical evidence of the existence of beings of superhuman strength and knowledge? Baalbek. Lebanon contains stones of more than 800 tons placed with incomprehensible millimetric precision. Pumapunku in Bolivia presents diorite blocks cut with perfect angles that are impossible without advanced technology. These ancient sites defy conventional explanations about the capabilities of primitive societies without modern tools. The Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, translates Nephilim as giants, using the word gigantes. But the Hebrew term Nephilim derives from Nephil, which means fallen or those who cause to fall. This suggests that their nature was not simply physical stature, but a spiritual condition of rebellion. They were fallen because they descended from rebellious angels and caused others to fall into sin and violence. The connection between the physical and the spiritual in these beings represents a corruption in multiple dimensions. Some Jewish apocalyptic texts claim that the spirits of the dead Nephilim became demons. These disembodied spirits would wander, causing oppression and possession, explaining the increase in subsequent demonic activity. The Book of Enoch details that the Nephilim had an extremely long life, some living more than 500 years. Their appetite was insatiable. They consumed all human production, and when it ran out, they began to devour humanity. This apocalyptic description paints a picture of terror where predatory giants completely dominated human populations. The violence was not only physical, but also spiritual, corrupting every aspect of antediluvian civilization. Genesis mentions that the Nephilim were the men of renown of antiquity, possibly the heroes of ancient mythologies. Hercules, Gilgamesh, the Greek titans, and semigods of diverse cultures could be distorted memories of real Nephilim. Global mythological narratives share common elements: hybrid divine human beings with supernatural strength and extreme longevity. These parallels suggest a collective memory of real events that were later mythologized according to each culture. The epic poem of Gilgamesh, older than many biblical texts, describes a king of gigantic stature and enormous strength. Gilgamesh was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a description that coincides perfectly with the hybrid Nephilim nature. His search for immortality and his encounter with the survivor of the flood reflect themes identical to the biblical narrative. The spiritual war of the Old Testament could be connected with the consequences of the original angelic rebellion. The prophets constantly faced not only human enemies, but spiritual forces that operated behind pagan empires. Daniel chapter 10 describes demonic princes over terrestrial kingdoms, suggesting a complex territorial spiritual hierarchy. These organized spiritual powers could be the same fallen angels who initiated the Nephilim corruption millennia ago. Satan's strategy has always been to corrupt the human genealogical line to thwart the divine plan. If he managed to genetically contaminate all of humanity, God's original purpose would theoretically be rendered impossible. The flood was necessary to preserve a pure human line that would keep the divine image intact. Noah represented the last hope of maintaining without corruption the essence of what it means to be truly human. That is why the text emphasizes his genealogical perfection, not just his moral rectitude, but his complete genetic integrity. The reappearance of giants after the flood represented a second attempt to sabotage the divine plan of redemption. The Old Testament prophets frequently denounced the mixing of Israel with Canaanite nations as abomination. It was not cultural xenophobia, but protection against a contamination that could be both spiritual and physical. The prohibition of mixed marriages had dimensions that go beyond simple religious or cultural differences. Ezra and Nehemiah forced mass divorces when they discovered that Israelites had married foreign women. This extreme severity suggests that they understood something about these unions that we have forgotten completely. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of the Book of Giants that expand the Nephilim narrative dramatically. They describe how these beings had prophetic dreams about their imminent destruction in the coming flood. Some texts suggest that the Nephilim knew their fate, but were incapable of repenting or changing. Their hybrid nature placed them in a category without possible redemption, neither completely human nor completely angelic. This intermediate condition explains why there was no provision of salvation for them in Noah's Ark. Only pure humanity could be preserved. The hybrids were destined for inevitable and total destruction. The judgment was so complete that even the bodies of the Nephilim were erased, leaving almost no trace. However, oral traditions of global cultures preserve memory of giants and beings, half divine, half human. Greeks spoke of Titans, Nephilim, Norse of Jotun, Hindus of Asuras, all with surprisingly similar characteristics. Polynesians have legends of Tiki, giant beings who built the massive statues of Easter Island. Native Americans preserve stories of a race of red-haired giants who were eventually exterminated by normal tribes. These transcultural coincidences suggest a real historical event that was remembered and mythologized differently by each civilization. The universal flood appears in more than 200 cultures with specific details that coincide astonishingly. A righteous man, a boat, preserved animals, judgment for moral corruption, and a new beginning for humanity. The persistence of these accounts in societies without mutual contact validates the historicity of the fundamental biblical event. If the flood was real, then the previous existence of Nephilim must also be considered historically plausible. Archaeological findings of skeletons of unusual stature have been reported, but rarely officially studied. Photographs of 19th century excavations show bones that significantly exceed normal human proportions. An 1876 report from the New York Times described the discovery of 3-meter skeletons. Spanish explorers in the 15th century documented encounters with natives of gigantic stature in Argentine Patagonia. The Cardiff giant, although later exposed as a fraud, generated massive interest precisely because it confirmed existing beliefs. The modern scientific community generally dismisses these findings as frauds or misinterpretations of animal remains. However, the consistency of historical reports from multiple continents deserves serious investigation without academic prejudice. Archaeological institutions avoid this topic because it challenges established evolutionary paradigms and officially accepted historical narratives. Admitting the possibility of ancient giants would require reconsidering chronologies and fundamental theories about human development. The suppression of uncomfortable evidence has happened before when findings contradict established dominant scientific consensuses. The Nephilim represent a problematic intersection between science, history, theology, and what we consider possible. Were they simply humans of great stature due to different environmental conditions in the antediluvian world? The prediluvian atmosphere could have had higher barometric pressure and oxygen concentration, allowing for greater growth. Some creationist scientists propose that an atmospheric water canopy created global hyperbaric chamber conditions. This would explain both the extreme longevity of antediluvian patriarchs and the possibility of gigantic growth. Or do the Nephilim represent something more disturbing, a direct intervention of dimensional entities in human genetics? The answer we accept defines our worldview on the nature of reality and history. If fallen angels really materialized and procreated with humans, the implications are completely revolutionary. It would mean that the supernatural can directly intervene in the natural in ways that science does not recognize. The philosophical materialism that dominates modern academia collapses before the possibility of interdimensional beings operating. That is why this topic generates such visceral rejection in secular academic circles beyond the evidential debate. It is not just big bones, it is about whether the universe operates solely according to natural laws. The Nephilim question forces us to confront whether there are spiritual realities that impact the physical world directly. The fallen angels, according to ancient texts, possessed knowledge that transcended the human understanding of that era. They taught advanced metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetology, enchantments, and manipulation of natural forces considered magical. This forbidden knowledge artificially accelerated technological development without the corresponding spiritual maturity to handle it. The antediluvian civilization could have reached technological levels comparable or superior to modern societies. Their complete destruction in the flood erased almost every trace of these advances, forcing humanity to start again. Post-diluvian patriarchs lived for centuries, but with decreasing longevity, possibly due to dramatic environmental changes. Noah lived 950 years, his son Shem, but Abraham barely 175 years. This progressive decrease suggests that the conditions of the post-diluvian world were fundamentally different and less favorable. If the atmosphere changed, the giant Nephilim genetics would also face limitations that would eventually reduce their presence. The last giants mentioned biblically appeared during the reign of David approximately 1,000 years before the Common Era. After that time, references to beings of extraordinary stature disappear almost completely from historical records. They became extinct naturally or were systematically eliminated for being considered existential threats to normal humanity. The divine orders to Israel to completely destroy certain Canaanite populations explicitly included the Nephilim descendants. This war of extermination was not arbitrary genocide, but surgical elimination of contaminated genetic lines. The mandate of Haram, total destruction, applied specifically to cities where the sons of Anak lived. Israel was to act as an instrument of divine judgment, completing what the flood had begun centuries ago. However, the Israelites did not completely obey these orders, allowing some groups to survive in coastal cities. The Philistines, who later produced Goliath and other giants, were descendants of populations that should have been eliminated. This failure to follow divine instructions completely resulted in continuous problems for generations for Israel. The persistent presence of giants became a constant thorn, threatening militarily and corrupting spiritually. David, being the smallest of his brothers, was chosen specifically to face the most feared giant of Philistia. His victory over Goliath was not just a military triumph, but a prophetic act of spiritual cleansing. Each defeated giant represented the continuous elimination of the genetic corruption that had begun before the flood. The sons of God who initiated this corruption were acting in direct rebellion against the created order. Genesis establishes that each species must reproduce according to its kind, maintaining clear barriers between created categories. The mixing of angelic beings with humans violated this fundamental principle, creating hybrid abominations. This transgression was not an accident, but a deliberate strategy to irreversibly corrupt divine creation. The fallen angels knew exactly what they were doing and the catastrophic consequences that would result. Their motivation was multifaceted: rebellion against the divine order, lust for forbidden physical experiences, and sabotage of the redemptive plan. By corrupting human genetics, they sought to make it impossible for a pure line to arise from which redemption would come. Each Nephilim born represented one step closer to the complete annihilation of true humanity. God did not send the flood capriciously, but as a last resort when contamination reached critical levels. The text says that all flesh had corrupted its way on earth, suggesting universal contamination. Only Noah and his immediate family maintained complete genetic integrity, making catastrophic intervention inevitable. The ark was not simply a rescue boat, but a genetic bank preserving the original creation. Each pair of animals represented the preservation of species in their original pure form, without manipulation. After the flood, God established a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the earth with water. However, prophetic texts warn that a final judgment will come, this time by fire, not by water. The destruction will be even more complete, leaving nothing of the current creation, except what is transformed. The Nephilim, whether completely extinct or existing in spiritual form, face this inevitable final judgment. There is no escape or possible redemption for the hybrids that arose from the original angelic rebellion. Their very existence was an affront to the divine order, an abomination with no place in the restored creation. That is why apocalyptic texts describe them being thrown eternally into the abyss prepared for the devil and his angels. The lake of fire was not created originally for humans, but for angelic beings who rebelled. The Nephilim, as a product of that rebellion, share the fate of their fallen angelic progenitors. So did the Nephilim survive the flood in some physical, genetic, or spiritual form that continues to affect us today. The biblical and extra-biblical evidence suggests that their presence continued post-flood, but their gradual extinction was inevitable. The last physical giants disappeared millennia ago, but their spiritual legacy persists in the ongoing cosmic war. The fallen angels who fathered them remain active, seeking to corrupt and destroy everything that God loves. But their time is limited and their final defeat is prophesied in texts that have proven to be reliable. The history of the Nephilim is not simply ancient curiosity, but a warning about spiritual realities present today. The forces that created antediluvian giants still operate, although perhaps in more subtle ways in our era. Modern genetic manipulation could be repeating the errors that once required global diluvian judgment. We must understand the past so as not to repeat the sins that almost destroyed humanity completely. The days of Noah were days of total corruption, extreme violence, and inevitable judgment that arrived suddenly. The prophetic signs suggest that we are approaching similar conditions that will again require divine intervention. If these ancient mysteries fascinate you and you want to discover more truths hidden in the scriptures, subscribe now. Every week we reveal biblical secrets that will transform your understanding of history, prophecy, and the spiritual world that surrounds us.